Thank you, everyone. Be seated, please. So we have a guest who needs no introduction. We have Lady Hale. Lady Hale was the first female president of the Supreme Court. And we have Akima Paul Lambert, who's a partner here at Novin Novels. And so there'll be a fireside chat between the two of them. Thank you, everyone. If you can all please be quiet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sultana. I wanted to start by saying a very warm welcome, Lady Hale, from all of us, Novin Novels and girls, people in our club. I know we don't have an incredibly long time with you, but I didn't want to start without saying thank you for providing us this gift of your presence. We're honored, we're privileged, we're very humbled to have you here today. And we are very thankful that you're able to come and to share your pearls of wisdom.
I'm delighted to be with you, and it's wonderful to be in a room full of young women. I'm mostly in rooms full of older men. So this is a great delight to me. Thank you.
And it's such a great delight to have you all here with us. So without further ado, I will go straight into it because I'm keen. I had 4 pages of questions and I'm very keen to get to them. Many of them as I possibly can fit in. So excuse me if I seem to be packing them in, but it's not very often we have first female Lady Supreme Court Justice with us. So Lady Hale, I purchased your book and it resonated quite deeply with me. And I would say probably with many of our girls. You had a love for reading, you described yourself as a speckled swat. You loved, you were born and you were raised in a town where a lot of the activities were defined by your faith, your church, you had a strong family influence. What was the defining moment or the defining aspect that laid the foundation that made young Brenda Lady Hale? What do you think was responsible for turning her into the frank and fearless advocate that we see here today?
I don't know the answer to that question. Who does? All the things you've mentioned, of course, growing up in a family which really believed that women could succeed. They're very egalitarian, my parents, and who also believed that education was the way to do that success. Took it for granted. They had 3 daughters, took it for granted they'd all go to university. This was at a time when only 2.5% of the girls in the relevant age group went to university. So that was quite an ambition to have. And I think it was that. And then the other thing added to all of that wonderful, useful background was the fact that my father died very suddenly when I was 13. And my mother, who had had to give up work when she married my father because there was a marriage bar in those days, aren't you lucky you don't have any of those problems? Yeah. Sort of picked herself up, dusted off her teaching qualifications, got herself a job to provide security and stability for her daughters. And I think that taught me you've got to become independent. You've got to have the means to look after yourself, even if you decide that you want to have a family, if you want to make a partnership in which you may take more of the family responsibility. You have to have the security of your own qualifications and experience.
Sage words. And just harking back, you were an excellent student, you were very good at languages, you had a passion for history, and you decided to study law. What made studying law a good choice for you?
Well, it was a choice because my headmistress wanted me to go to either Oxford or Cambridge, thought I was clever enough to do that, but didn't think I was a natural historian. So I always say I chose law because my headmistress didn't think I was clever enough to do history. Not sure that that was true, and when I got to Cambridge to study law, I absolutely loved it and realised that I was good at it. Of course, I didn't know I was going to be good at it. I just thought it's interesting, but it did turn out I was quite good at it.
Yeah, and now young women are being pursued to study different things, AI, coding, cryptocurrency, asset management, financial services. In your view, and I know it's very difficult to have a crystal ball into the future, does law remain a great choice for girls?
I would have thought so, But that's not to put anybody off doing whatever it is that they think they would like to do and think they would be good at. Because what I always say to people is it's vital to find something that you enjoy doing. You don't have to enjoy it all. Very few law students would say that they enjoyed every single subject that they studied. Just looking at the lawyers in the room. Yeah, I mean, there are people who like land law, but not the majority. But as long as you find something that you really are enthusiastic about and enjoy, that's great, because then you'll work hard and then you'll be the best you can at it. And it's a virtuous circle. So it doesn't matter which of those many choices, it's finding the one that suits you.
And that's great advice. And I mentioned to you that while I was on my way in, my son said to me, "Are you going to speak to the spider lady today?" He's only 6 because he's seen me walking around with this book. And I said, "What do you want me to ask?" And your advice, do something that you love and enjoy. He said to me, "Ask her if she loves her job. What are the aspects of the job that you particularly love?"
Oh, well, it's a very good question. Of course, I no longer have a day job. I reached the magic age of 75, which meant that I had to retire as president of the Supreme Court. I was perfectly happy to do that. I've been there, done that, done a lot. But I've loved every job I've done. I was a university teacher for 18 years, and I loved university students, all these bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young people coming along, enthusiastic about what they were doing, and then you had to sort of own that enthusiasm and turn it into something. I like being a baby barrister. I did a bit of that. I mean, persuading judges to do things they don't want to do is really quite a challenge. I loved being a law commissioner. This is where you promote law reform. So what's not to like? The subject that you feel most strongly about, that there are things that need to be done, you can go along and you can make recommendations which stand a chance of actually being implemented, which quite a few of mine were, most of them were. That's a wonderful thing. And then I became a judge. And actually, being a judge, the lawyers in the room, I do recommend it. It's got a lot to recommend it. It's a lonely job, especially if you're doing civil and family cases where you are the decision maker. Not so lonely if you're doing criminal cases, because you can blame the jury for the decisions. But I love that. I love being a trial judge. I love being an appeal judge. I love being in the top court in the land. So had I not been fortunate, what did I do to deserve all that good fortune?
You were you. And just staying with that a little bit on your jobs, your multiple jobs. You have done so much at the Law Commission. You're responsible for some of the work on the Children's Act 1989, Family Law Act. Again, you were at the helm of some of our most impressive constitutional and human rights judgments, the prorogation of Parliament, just watching you deliver that judgment with such force and confidence. I think it had an impact on pretty much everyone. What were your favorite moments and what were your most impactful, you would say? And they may not necessarily be the same, but they may be.
Well, I think the favorite moments are when you are able to reach a decision which moves the law on in the direction that you want it to be moved on, and you bring your colleagues with you. So we had a case in which we decided that violence was a much wider concept than simply hitting. Men are afraid of being hit, possibly, but there are many other things that women are afraid of and which are used to dominate women and coerce them, which aren't necessarily hitting. And we were able to say that violence included that whole spectrum. We got everybody to agree, and that's a wonderfully satisfying thing. So that is satisfying. It was particularly satisfying that everybody agreed in the prorogation case. But 11 very independent-minded, very forceful, very able lawyers, all reaching the conclusion that the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty that Parliament should be suspended for such a long time, at such a crucial time in the history of the country, was unlawful. That is something to be really quite pleased about.
Absolutely, and separate my thinking as you're saying this, Lady Hale, is separate on the part of the decision itself. How do you get a group of, men to agree unanimously? I mean, it's difficult enough like getting a mixed group to agree, but how do you get a group of very senior older men to agree? Is there some special feminine touch? Is there some special Lady Hale touch?
No,
Can you share your tips?
No, I don't think it's anything to do with me. I think it was because we were right.
Well, that helps.
Yes, I think it definitely does help. One thing that I did do, and I did exactly what my predecessor had done when we had a similarly difficult case, also involving Mrs. Miller. I got everybody to write down on a sheet of A4 paper their answers to the 4 questions that we had to answer. And to do that after we'd heard 2 days of the argument, and we'd still got another day of argument to come, which meant that we could start the final day with a pretty clear idea as to what the answers to those questions, or at least 3 of the questions, were going to be, because it was fairly clear that we were all thinking in a very similar way. So I think that helped with the reaching agreement, and we were able to sort of fine tune our thinking in the course of the day and concentrate on the thing that we hadn't really got to the bottom of. So, but I don't think that was a particularly feminine thing at all. I think it was just that the logic of the situation was pretty inexorable. That's the great thing about law, you can reason to a conclusion, isn't it? That's the wonderful thing. You can actually work out what the right answer is.
And do you think, I mean, maybe just developing, the idea of consensus building. I mean, you spend years, as you say, as a teacher. Do you think that informs the way in which you approach consensus building? And in some respects, you have been a little bit of an outsider. The traditional wisdom is you become a barrister, then you become a KC, you argue cases in court. And many times I would see tons of barristers who don't know how to build consensus. Because they're very fixated on getting to their version of what is right. Do you think that sense of having a different perspective has been one of your I know you don't like us to say that you have a superpower, but has it been a superpower? Has it been an additional strength?
I think there are 2 possible strengths. One of which was 18 years of university teaching meant that on the whole, I could explain myself quite clearly. And university students do tend to say they like to read my judgments because they are easy to understand, clear, well worked out. And I think that's got something to do with having been a teacher. The other thing is that obviously, as both a university teacher and as a law reformer, you have to be prepared to listen to both sides, or even more than both sides of an argument. You've got to be prepared to take in both sides. Whereas, of course, as an advocate and even a litigator, you have to do what Lord Justice Sedley described as reasoning from a given conclusion. So you start with the best outcome you can get for your client, and then you work out backwards what's the best way to get there. Whereas, of course, as a judge, you shouldn't be starting from a conclusion. You should be starting from the law, the legal materials, the facts, the evidence, and working towards conclusion. You start at the beginning and get to the end, rather than starting at the end and then going back to the beginning. So I think those are 2 strengths.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. And I wish we had more time that we could really delve into these. But I just wanted to go back for the benefit of our girls. You went up to Cambridge, to Girton College. I also went to Cambridge straight from the Caribbean, in a summer jacket. It was very cold, stupidly. You were better prepared than I was. But there were no women. There were no women on the law faculty, no female role models, and you've got to start first. You thrived in that environment. How did you do it? And what lessons can you impart? What are the tips that you can give to our girls? I'm very big on the tips. I'm sorry, because
Yes.
I really want to learn from you and what you gained out of the experience.
Well, of course, the experience is very different today. When I went up to Cambridge, there were all the colleges were single sex. So there were 3 colleges for women and 21 colleges for men. So there weren't a lot of women around. But the great thing that the women had was this sense that they were privileged to be there. You know, we knew that we were a small group of people who had got this enormous advantage of going to one of the best universities in the world. And I think that sense of this is something we must make the most of was good for us. Whereas in those days, I think things have changed. They will have changed in your day. In those days, there were an awful lot of entitled young men about. Mainly posh public school boys.
Sounds very familiar.
Yeah. Well, they took it for granted that they were entitled to be there. And then they were going to be entitled to get a good job in the city or whatever. And we didn't take anything for granted. And I think not taking things for granted is a good thing, not a bad thing. And I think on the whole, we did better than those entitled young men because we knew what a benefit we had. So again, I think we should be grateful for the benefits that we have and make the most of them.
Absolutely. And one other thing in your career, it's difficult not to be floored by your list of first, first student from your school to get into Cambridge, first and youngest to sit on the law commission, first woman to become, president of the Supreme Court. And it's something I struggle with. I'm often referred to, I'm always, or for a very long time, the first Black woman in a particular space. Or sometimes when I was a trainee, you'd go to court and you wouldn't see anyone who looked like you. It's a burden and it's an opportunity. What has been the hardest thing in your view about going first or being first, and what is the easiest?
Oh, well, the hardest thing is what we now call imposter syndrome. Because I think at every point when I have made a step up in my career, I have asked myself, well, should I really be here? Can I do it? And of course, you then work hard at being able to do it, and you find out eventually that, of course, you can do it. What I tend to say because it's a very, very common thing, I think a lot of people feel it. Maybe more women feel it than men do, I'm not entirely sure about that. But women are probably much more able to confess it than men are. But what I tend to say to people is, well, if you suspect that you've been given a job because they want somebody like you, whether they want a woman or whether they want an ethnic minority or whatever, say to yourself, okay, somebody thinks I can do this job. So it's my business to give it my best and see whether I can do this job. It turns out that it doesn't work out for whatever reason. It's their fault, not yours.
I like that.
So, in other words, give it a go, and then it's not your fault if it doesn't work out. But so the worst thing is, and also the best thing is imposter syndrome, I think.
I also think that you do get a blank slate. And one of the things I admire about you is how forthright you are on gender equality. You describe yourself as a feminist. Not many women do that. Your coat of arms, it says women are equal to everything. You say exactly what is on your mind. In fact, the things that are on my mind, how is it an agenda when we as women, challenging the male-dominated status quo? How can it be seen as an agenda? Really, it's an agenda the other way. You've done that. You've been the first. You've been the only. You've done that, being very forthright. And sometimes the received wisdom is don't frighten the horses. And I think you refer to that a lot in your book. How do you strike a balance between agitating for change and not frightening the horses? That fair that if you do too much, then they won't ever hire someone else like you.
Yes, well, that is a bit of a problem. I think you have to be nice. You know, you have to do your best to get on with people rather than to look as if you're fighting them. Because you're not fighting them, you're just fighting for what's right, which is a bit different. And a bit of alleviating people's anxieties, you know, that you are going to be this strained, difficult woman. And on the whole, I don't think people found me too difficult to work with, despite the fact I was prepared to speak up for equality on all sorts of dimensions. Gender equality was top of the list, but that's because women are more than half the human race, so it's a bit of a shame if we're not more than half the positions of seniority and authority and so on. But there are many other dimensions which are equally important. So I think it's probably not the same these days, but women who were entering a man's world in the olden days had to decide whether they were going to behave like the men and pretend to be as much like the men as possible, or whether they were going to be women and make no secret of the fact that they were women. And the first two women High Court judges, one was one of them and the other was the other. Rose Halbron was the other. She never made any secret of the fact that she was a woman, a beautiful woman with a beautiful voice and a beautiful smile, and she was equally successful. But I think it is, to some extent, a choice that was very much there in those days and may, to a limited extent, still be the case. Now, I believe that women should not be afraid to be women, and we're not exactly the same as men. We don't look the same as men do, nor should we try to look the same as men. And there are some aspects of our behaviour which tend to be a bit different. I mean, I think on the whole we smile a lot, don't we? And that's not a bad thing. Even in litigation, it's not a bad thing, is it? It lightens what can be a very tense atmosphere. So I think we shouldn't be afraid to be women. But it is a bit of a choice, because if you're not afraid to be a woman, there will be men who accuse you of being flirtatious, you know, of using your femininity to get your own way, as opposed to using your abilities and the justice of whatever it is that you want to do. So one has to be conscious of that and not try to be flirtatious while still being definitely a woman. So does that all make sense to you?
It makes sense. And if I may, I'll just probably add one final substantive question. What can the legal system be doing to promote greater diversity in profession? What are the priorities, or what is one priority that you think should be top and front and center of the legislative agenda?
Legislative agenda, I think.
Or otherwise?
I think it's more putting into practice
It's already there.
a proper view of how you promote diversity and inclusion. And I now think that inclusion is the necessary other half of diversity. So this goes back to what I was saying about when women started to join men's professions. They were expected, often by the men, to behave like men, and sometimes they did, whereas now that is no longer the case. And so similarly, if you are going to promote diversity, you've got to be prepared to accept diversity as a good thing for its own sake, and not to try and turn diverse candidates, diverse people into posh white men, because that's not the world these days. So inclusion is really, really important. Just want to tell a little story. A friend of mine who is a circuit judge up in the Northwest went to sit at a big Crown Court centre, where the resident judge was, of course, a man. This was a few years ago, but not very long ago. And he apparently said when she arrived, I don't think any of the women judges who have sat here can complain that they weren't treated like one of the boys. And I think that sums up the thing that we have to try and get over. So inclusion is really important. And that, of course, brings with it thinking very carefully about working practices and how inclusive they are. Because firms like this have working practices which make life extremely difficult for all sorts of people, whether they're men, women, or whatever, if they want to have a particular work-life balance, or work outside the home, work inside the home balance. Life-life balance, should we put it that way? I think life-life balance is the right way to put it, yeah. And so there is a big piece of work to be done, particularly in the legal profession, in looking at their working practices. Does it have to be this way?
I think that's a lovely note on which to end, but I have a couple of spitfire questions and you just need to pick one. I'm afraid I'm going to be the judge today. Richmond, London or Richmond, Yorkshire?
Oh, Richmond, Yorkshire.
I know that's where Lady Hale is.
Richmond, Yorkshire is the real Richmond. Every other Richmond in the world, and there's more than 100 of them, is directly or indirectly named after the Richmond in Yorkshire, which is a very beautiful medieval town, and you should all come and visit it and enjoy its beauties.
Lady Hale said so. University of Cambridge or University of Manchester? Difficult one. You taught at one, you went to one.
They're very different institutions. You mentioned Cambridge is cold, but Cambridge is dry. Cambridge is beautiful. Manchester is neither dry nor beautiful.
Great answer. Plead the fifth. My uncle lives in Manchester. Lawyers or teachers?
Well, both. Can't choose between them.
I'll accept this one deviation. Wigs or robes?
Well, it's definitely not wigs. I have always objected to wigs. I mean, they look so ridiculous. They really do look ridiculous. And my real objection to them is that they're men's wigs. So until the 1990s, women barristers and judges were obliged to wear men's wigs on their heads, but were not allowed to wear trousers. They had to wear skirts. Now, don't you think that's ridiculous? Now we can, of course, wear trousers, so that's all right. But they're still men's wigs, and they make it look as if the only way to be taken seriously is to look like a man. Back to what I was saying before, and we have to fight that. Of course, in family courts, people don't wear robes. In civil courts, most civil courts, they don't wear wigs anymore. So it's gradually, but we've still got the criminal courts where everybody thinks the only proper lawyer and judge is somebody wearing a wig. We have to try and find a way of doing that.
And a bit of a girly SWAT one. Human Rights Act, yes or no?
Oh, goodness me, yes.
Absolutely. And last one, spiders or frogs?
Well, I have a particular private reason for liking frogs.
Frog prints?
The frog prints, yes, yes. And there are frogs on my coat of arms as well. The spider was a mistake. There's no doubt the spider was a mistake. If I had known that The Who had a song called Boris the Spider, I would not have worn a spider on that day, because I'm afraid Boris the Spider came to a very sticky end. And it's not a very good song either. So I'd have worn something else. But it might have been a frog, and then people would have said, oh, what does she mean by wearing a frog? Or so.
And then you may have been the frog woman, which I think doesn't have the same ring to it.
It doesn't, does it? No, no.
But thank you very much, Lady Hale. As I was preparing, I always thought, I said to myself, when I started at Cambridge, everyone pointed to the judgments of Lord Denning, man who was a pioneer and a reformer. And I would be very surprised if in many years from now that you haven't taken that spot. As you say, your judgments, your initiative, your humor, your humanity. We admire all of that and more about you. And you are one of the shoulders on which we will continue to sit as we move forward in the law. So I am very, very happy to have had this opportunity. I'm very, very delighted and honored that you came to visit us here at Golden Levels and with Girls Human Rights Hub, and you're more than welcome to come back at any time to tell us about how we can dismantle working practices. So I will put a pause, a comma on that conversation, not a full stop. Thank you very much. It's been